Canada's forestry industry was being squeezed hard, and many thought it would struggle to survive. But instead of backing down, Canada launched a bold response that is now changing the game. While the US tried to weaken a key Canadian industry, the move may have pushed Canada towards something stronger, more independent, and far more difficult to stop. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood inside the Gorman Brothers lumber sawmill in West Kelowna, British Columbia, and announced $1.2 billion in financial support for an industry that American trade duties had pushed to the edge. The package included $700 million in loan guarantees, allowing forestry companies to access financing to restructure operations and reduce the industry's heavy reliance on exports to the United States, alongside $500 million in grants and contributions to diversify markets and develop new product lines such as reinforced timber and low-carbon wood fiber-based insulation. 8 months later, that single announcement had grown into something far larger, a sustained, multi-billion-dollar federal and provincial defense of an entire industrial sector under direct attack from across the border. The dispute sits inside broader talks between the United States and Canada on a new economic and defense relationship. President Trump hiked tariffs on some Canadian imports to 35% in late July 2025 after negotiators failed to meet an August 1st deadline. The U.S. Commerce Department had separately announced it was almost tripling anti-dumping duties on most Canadian softwood to 20.56%, and Canadian officials projected that once combined with new countervailing charges, total duties would rise to 34.5% from the previous 14.5%. Some industry estimates have since put the combined tariff burden closer to 45% once every layer of duty is stacked together. Carney, speaking to reporters in British Columbia, said Ottawa would make up to $700 million available in loan guarantees and provide $500 million to help speed product development and market diversification. The structural intent behind that $1.2 billion was explicit from the moment it was announced, not simply to cushion the tariff impact, but to permanently reduce Canadian sawmills' dependence on a single customer that had demonstrated repeatedly across 4 decades of disputes a willingness to weaponize trade policy against the industry. The scale of that dependence explains why the federal response had to be this large. Last year, nearly 12 billion board feet, about 59% of Canadian softwood lumber shipments, went to the United States, a share that has oscillated between 50 and 60% for the past decade. On a value basis, softwood lumber exports totaled 7.6 billion Canadian dollars. Almost 90% of Canadian lumber exports go to the US, according to Carney's own framing of the dispute, when accounting for the full range of softwood and value-added wood products beyond raw lumber alone. A single buyer commanding that share of total output gives that buyer the kind of leverage that a 21 percentage point tariff increase can convert directly into existential pressure on rural mill towns. The $1.2 billion package was integrated with a strategy called Build Canada Homes, designed to double the rate of new home construction to 500,000 units a year. Carney said that increase would double the use of Canadian softwood lumber in new domestic homes to nearly 2 billion board feet per year, while also doubling demand for structural panels. That domestic demand pivot is the structural core of Canada's lumber strategy. Redirect a portion of the supply that tariffs make uneconomical to ship south and consume it instead inside a federally accelerated domestic housing construction program. The August announcement was only the beginning of a sustained sequence of federal support measures that accumulated through the fall and winter of 2025 into 2026. In September 2025, the Government of Canada launched a series of additional measures: flexibilities to the large enterprise tariff loan facility, including lower interest rates and longer maturities, and a significant expansion of the Regional Tariff Response Initiative, first created in March 2025 from $450 million to $1 billion over 3 years to support businesses, particularly small and medium enterprises, directly or indirectly impacted by U.S. tariffs. That same September, the Business Development Bank of Canada announced it would offer loans of $2 million to $5 million for SMEs impacted by tariffs. A new reskilling package was also announced, designed to train 50,000 workers through federal labor market development agreements with provinces and territories, backed by an additional $450 million over 3 years, specifically targeting mid-career, long-tenured workers affected by U.S. tariffs and global market shifts. A separate Workforce Alliances and Sectoral Workforce Innovation Fund committed $382 million over 5 years to projects tailored to local job market. By November 2025, the government had pledged to prioritize Canadian suppliers in federal spending through an amended Buy Canada policy, requiring all federal agencies and crown corporations to follow Canadian procurement preferences. By April 2026, the cumulative scale of that support had become the subject of formal American protest. Since August 2025, Canada had announced an estimated 2.1 billion Canadian dollars in forestry-specific subsidies. In total, Canada pledged to make available more than 9.9 billion Canadian dollars to support the forestry industry, including $1.7 billion in direct federal forestry subsidies and access to more than $9.152 billion in total available aid. Canadian federal and provincial governments have announced over $2.1 billion worth of new taxpayer-funded subsidies for the Canadian forestry sector in the last 7 months in response to the enforcement of U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing laws and imposition of President Trump's Section 232 tariff measures. The U.S. Lumber Coalition stated on April 2, 2026, responding to U.S. trade law enforcement by doubling down on Canada's unfair trade practices is both reprehensible and counterproductive, said Zoltan van Heiningen, Executive Director of the U.S. Lumber Coalition. The American industry-specific objection extends beyond the dollar figure into a structural critique of how Canadian government support interacts with the U.S. tariff mechanism itself. Targeted industry support like this is exactly the type of unfair subsidy that our long-standing trade laws are designed to address. Von Heiningen said in October 2025, following the fast-tracking of Carney's original $1.2 billion package. I sincerely hope that Canadian taxpayers are paying close attention. The cycle is obvious. Canadian lumber companies receive subsidies from their government, which are then collected by the U.S. government as duties at the border when those companies ship into the U.S. That argument describes a closed loop. Canadian government money supports producers. Those producers ship into the United States. The U.S. government collects countervailing duties calculated partly in response to that same support, and the cycle generates ongoing American Treasury revenue precisely because Canada keeps responding to higher duties with more support. Canadian mill operators are not in a financial position to simply absorb a 21 percentage point increase in duties without consequence. Mills curtail output rather than continue producing at heavy losses until prices adjust. There is also typically some pass-through of tariff costs from buyer to seller. Between mills reducing output, price pass-through to American buyers, and U.S. demand likely falling 2 to 3% in 2025, as the housing market continues to slow, the absolute financial impact compounds across the entire supply chain. BC's forestry industry had already taken major hits over the preceding years, as escalating U.S. duties piled atop a number of other challenges, leading to thousands of job losses across the province before the August 2025 support package was even announced.